I'm the authority here, and you'll learn to respect it. Sit down. The voice was cold, sharp like the buzz of the electric clippers he gripped in his hand. She stared at him, her eyes defiant yet pleading, as the room full of witnesses held their breath. The barber shop, once filled with the hum of conversations and laughter, now felt suffocatingly silent, like the air had been sucked out of it. This wasn't just about her hair. It wasn't about grooming or appearance. This was about power. A power he had decided to abuse in the most degrading way possible. To strip her of dignity, to remind her, in his twisted mind, that she didn't belong. That, no matter what, she was beneath him. Moments before, she had walked into the barber shop to greet a friend, her radiant presence lighting up the room. It was supposed to be a quick stop during her busy day, a brief moment of camaraderie in her community. But everything changed when he walked in. The officer, a man who wore his badge like a weapon, scanned the room with an air of superiority. His gaze locked onto her, lingering with a mix of disdain and smugness. There was no warning, no explanation. Just his voice cutting through the air, "Stand up. Empty your pockets." Confusion filled the room as she hesitated, taken aback by the abrupt command. "Did I stutter?" he barked, stepping closer, his presence suffocating. "I said empty your pockets. Now." She raised her chin, her composure steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Why are you? Don't talk back to me," he snapped, his voice growing louder. "I know your type. You people think you can just walk around like you own the place. But not today." Gasps rippled through the barbershop. The tension in the air was thick, charged with a mixture of fear and anger. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of years spent enduring this kind of treatment. "Officer, I'm asking you again, why are you stopping me? I'm just here to say hello to a friend." "That's not a crime." But her words didn't matter to him. Her calm demeanor, her self-assured presence, these only seemed to inflame his prejudice. "You're resisting." He smiled coldly, his hand reaching for the clippers on the counter. "Let me show you what happens when you resist." The crowd murmured, shocked and horrified. One older man stepped forward. "Officer, she's not doing anything, shut up and stay out of this," the officer barked, cutting him off. The older man reluctantly stepped back, his eyes filled with helplessness. The officer's tone was venomous as he turned his attention back to her. "You think you're untouchable? You think your attitude doesn't need adjusting? Let's fix that." Before anyone could process what was happening, he grabbed a chair and motioned for her to sit. "Sit down," he growled again, his grip tightening on the clippers. "Or do I need to force you?" Her heart raced. Her mind spun with a mix of disbelief and rage. The room around her blurred as she tried to steady herself, to maintain the dignity he was so determined to strip away. The sound of the clippers whirring to life sent a jolt through her body. She sat down slowly, her eyes locking onto his, refusing to look away. "If this is what it takes for you to feel powerful," she said softly, "then go ahead." The barbershop seemed frozen in time, every pair of eyes fixed on the cruel display unfolding in front of them. The officer pressed the clippers to her hair, the sound of it cutting through her curls echoing louder than anything else in the room. Each strand that fell was a reminder of the systemic injustice she'd faced her entire life. For him, it was a moment of triumph, a public display of dominance. For her, it was a moment of humiliation, yet one she endured with unwavering strength. When he finally stepped back, a smug smile on his face, he tossed the clippers onto the counter. "There. Now maybe you'll learn your place." The room was silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on everyone. She stood up slowly, running her hand over her shorn head, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something unbroken, something defiant. As she walked out of the barber shop, her head held high despite the degradation she had just endured, a ripple of whispers followed her. Everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed something deeply wrong. But none of them, not even the officer, had any idea who she really was. He thought he had one. But the truth was, his actions that day had set something much bigger into motion. What happens when the person you try to humiliate turns out to have more power than you ever imagined? What happens when the tables turn, and justice comes knocking, hard? Stay with us to uncover the shocking fallout of that day, a story of vengeance, redemption, and a lesson the officer would never forget. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to say this: here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To every black viewer watching this, know that your voice, your presence, and your experiences matter deeply. You deserve respect, dignity, and justice in every space you occupy. Together, we stand for equality and truth. Thank you for choosing to be here with us today. If you enjoy stories with impactful twists and lessons, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Now, sit back and enjoy this powerful story. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the community barbershop, casting streaks of warm light across the tiled floor. The shop was a hub of life in the neighborhood, a place where people shared stories, debated sports, and laughed about the ups and downs of daily life. It smelled of aftershave, freshly brewed coffee, and the faint metallic tang of clippers. Sitting in one of the barber chairs was Maya Carter, a confident, poised woman in her early 40s. She exuded an air of quiet authority, a presence that naturally commanded respect. Her deep brown skin glowed under the sunlight, her natural curls perfectly styled, a signature of her unapologetic pride in who she was. Maya was more than a regular at this barbershop, she was a pillar of the community. As a former public defender turned reform advocate, she spent years fighting for fairness in a city plagued by systemic inequity. But no one here, not even her closest friends, knew the full extent of the power she wielded. Maya had always been driven. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Atlanta, she learned early on that the world wasn't fair, especially for a black woman. Her father, a mechanic, often spoke of the silent barriers he faced, while her mother, a teacher, taught Maya that education and resilience were her greatest tools. It was this blend of practicality and hope that had carried her through law school and into a career that often felt like a battle against the tide. Yet Maya wasn't just defined by her career. She was a mother to an 11-year-old boy named Jaden, a bright and curious child who shared her sharp wit and determination. Jaden adored his mother but sometimes struggled to understand the weight she carried on her shoulders. "Why do you always have to fight, Mom?" he had asked once, his big eyes searching hers. Her answer had been simple but honest: "Because if I don't, who will?" The barbershop was one of Maya's few sanctuaries, a place where she could shed her armor for a while and just be Maya, not the lawyer, not the advocate, just a neighbor and a friend. This morning, she had stopped by to catch up with Terrence, the shop's owner and an old friend from her high school days. Terrence was a tall, broad man with a booming laugh and a knack for putting people at ease. His barbershop wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline for the community, a space where everyone felt seen and heard. As Maya sat in the chair, sipping a cup of coffee and chatting with Terrence about a new mentorship program she was helping to launch, the sound of the shop's bell jingling interrupted the easy rhythm of the morning. In walked Officer Ryan Henderson, a white police officer with a reputation that preceded him. Henderson was in his mid-40s, with a clean-cut appearance that masked a troubling history. He wasn't new to the neighborhood, but he wasn't welcome either. The stories about him ranged from routine harassment to outright abuse of power, particularly toward black residents. Ryan Henderson didn't see himself as a bad man. In his mind, he was just doing his job, keeping order in a city that, to him, often felt on the brink of chaos. But his idea of order was deeply flawed, shaped by prejudices he refused to confront. To Henderson, people like Maya represented a challenge to his authority, a reminder of a world that was changing faster than he could accept. As Henderson stepped inside, the lively chatter of the barbershop dwindled into an uneasy silence. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on Maya with a flicker of recognition. For a brief moment, she met his eyes, her expression calm but firm. Maya had encountered men like Henderson before, men who wore their insecurity like a badge, hiding their fear of losing control behind an inflated sense of power. "Morning, folks," Henderson said, his tone casual but laced with an undertone that set everyone on edge. He glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the cash register, the young barber sweeping hair from the floor, and finally, on Maya. "You," he said abruptly, pointing at her. "Stand up." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Maya raised an eyebrow, her coffee cup pausing midair. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady. "You heard me," Henderson replied, his jaw tightening. "Empty your pockets. Let's go." Terrence stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on, officer?" "She hasn't done anything." "Stay out of it," Henderson snapped, not even looking at him. "This isn't your concern." Maya stood slowly, setting her coffee cup on the counter. "I'd like to know what this is about," she said, her tone measured but firm. "I'm not carrying anything illegal, and I haven't broken any laws. So why are you targeting me?" Henderson's smirk was cold, almost predatory. "I don't need a reason. You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Now, either you cooperate, or I'll have to escalate this." The room tensed. A young mother in the corner covered her son's eyes, while an elderly man muttered under his breath, "This ain't right." Maya held Henderson's gaze, refusing to flinch. "Escalate it how?" she asked. Her voice wasn't raised, but the power in her words was unmistakable. Henderson took a step closer, invading her personal space. "Are you resisting?" he said, his hand resting on the clippers Terrence had left on the counter. The absurdity of the situation hit Maya all at once. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a threat. Yet here she was, being treated like one in front of her community. Still, she refused to let him see her anger. Instead, she stood taller, her voice calm. "I'm not resisting. I'm standing my ground." But Henderson wasn't interested in her words. He picked up the clippers, holding them up like a weapon. "Then sit down. Let's see if a little humility will teach you some respect." The room erupted in protests, but Henderson silenced them with a glare. "Nobody move," he barked. "This is between me and her." Maya's heart pounded as she lowered herself into the chair, every muscle in her body taut with tension. The clippers buzzed to life, and Henderson leaned in, his voice low. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you? Let's see how high and mighty you feel when I'm done." As he brought the clippers to her hair, the shop fell silent again. Every eye was on Maya, watching as she endured this act of degradation with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. When it was over, she stood up, brushing the loose strands of hair from her shoulders. Her voice was steady, her gaze unflinching as she looked at Henderson. "You may think you've won," she said quietly, "but you have no idea who I am." The officer scoffed, dismissing her words. But as Maya walked out of the shop, a ripple of unease followed her. For everyone in that room, the question lingered, who was she really? And what would happen now? The following morning, the buzz around the incident in the barbershop had already started to ripple through the neighborhood. Conversations spilled out from corner stores, church steps, and front porches. Everyone had heard about the officer's actions, but nobody seemed to know what would come of it. The tension was palpable, a mix of anger, helplessness, and an unspoken hope that maybe, this time, there would be consequences. Maya's son, Jaden, noticed something was off as soon as she came home the previous evening. "Mom," he said quietly as she stood by the kitchen sink, staring out the window. "What happened to your hair?" Maya turned to him slowly, the weight of the day etched into her features. She knelt down, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, Jaden, people in this world think they can take something from you to make themselves feel bigger. But they can't take what really matters." Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You understand?" Jaden nodded, his small hand reaching up to touch the stubble on her head. "You still look like a superhero," he said softly. Maya smiled, pulling him into a hug, but inside, a storm was brewing. By mid-morning, Maya had already put a plan into motion. She sat at her desk, phone in hand, scrolling through contacts and typing messages. The humiliation she endured wasn't just personal, it was a symptom of a broken system, and she was determined to use every tool at her disposal to expose it. But Maya wasn't acting out of pure anger, she was calculating, precise. She knew the stakes, and she knew this fight wasn't just about her. It was about every person in her community who had faced the same abuse but didn't have the resources or platform to fight back. Terrence called just as she was finalizing an email. His voice was heavy with guilt. "Maya," he started, "I've been sitting here all night replaying everything. I should have done more." "I should have, you did what you could," Maya interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "If you had stepped in, he would have turned his attention on you. That's what people like him do, they thrive on intimidation." Terrence hesitated, then said, "What are you going to do?" Maya leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the ceiling. "I'm going to remind him, and everyone else, that there are limits to power. And when those limits are crossed, there are consequences." That afternoon, Maya made her first public appearance since the incident. She attended a community meeting at a local recreation center, where residents gathered to discuss issues ranging from housing to policing. As she entered the room, heads turned, and a hush fell over the crowd. Her presence was commanding, even with her shaved head, a reminder of what had been taken from her, but also a symbol of her resilience. One of the speakers, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Ellis, stood at the front of the room, her voice trembling as she recounted an encounter her teenage son had with the same officer a few months prior. "He wasn't doing anything wrong," she said, clutching a tissue in her hand. "But that man treated him like a criminal, like he didn't belong here. I filed a complaint, but nothing happened. They said there wasn't enough evidence." Maya stepped forward, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the room. "Mrs. Ellis, your story isn't isolated. And that's the problem. Too many of us have been told our experiences don't count because we don't have evidence. But today, we're going to change that." A man in the back raised his hand. "How, Maya? That officer's been walking around like he owns this place for years. They protect their own." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Maya raised a hand to quiet them. "I know it feels like the system is rigged against us, and in many ways, it is. But change starts when we refuse to stay silent. We have a voice, and we're going to use it." As the meeting concluded, Maya stayed behind, speaking one-on-one with residents who had their own stories of harassment. Each account fueled her determination. By the end of the day, she had a growing list of witnesses, complaints, and names. Meanwhile, Officer Ryan Henderson went about his day as if nothing had happened. In his mind, the barbershop incident was already behind him. He had dealt with people like Maya before, people who thought they could challenge his authority, and he knew the system was designed to protect him. As long as he followed protocol, there was little anyone could do. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Maya's parting words had carried a weight he hadn't fully grasped. The next morning, Henderson arrived at the precinct to find an unusual buzz in the air. Officers whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. As he approached his desk, his partner, Officer Daniels, leaned in with a smirk. "Looks like you've made a name for yourself," Daniels said, sliding a newspaper across the desk. The headline read, "Officers' Abuse Sparks Outrage, Community Demands Accountability." Below the headline was a photo of the barbershop and a smaller image of Maya speaking at the community meeting. Henderson's jaw tightened as he scanned the article. It detailed not only the incident in the barbershop but also a pattern of complaints against him. "Let them talk," Henderson muttered, crumpling the paper. "It won't stick." But Maya wasn't done. Later that week, she attended a city council meeting, where she stood before a panel of elected officials and police representatives. Her voice was calm but commanding as she laid out her case, presenting video footage from the barbershop security cameras and testimonies from other victims. "This isn't just about one officer," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "This is about a culture of unchecked power and prejudice. And it's time for that to change." The council members shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. Maya knew she was pushing against a deeply entrenched system, but she also knew she had struck a nerve. The meeting ended with a promise to investigate the claims, but Maya could sense the reluctance in their words. That night, Maya sat alone in her living room, reviewing her notes and planning her next steps. The weight of the fight ahead was heavy, but so was her resolve. Jaden walked in, his face serious. "Mom," he said, "do you think he's scared of you now?" Maya smiled faintly, pulling him close. "He should be," she said quietly. "But this isn't just about fear. It's about making sure no one else goes through what we've been through." Outside, the city hummed with anticipation. The stage was set, and the pieces were moving. What Henderson didn't realize, and what even Maya couldn't fully anticipate, was just how far-reaching the consequences of his actions would be. The system that had protected him for so long was about to be shaken to its core. And the question lingering in everyone's mind wasn't whether justice would come, but how. The day had arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Maya stood outside the precinct, her calm demeanor hiding the storm of emotions brewing inside her. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the culmination of weeks of meticulous planning. Her heart pounded, but her steps were steady as she walked through the glass doors, the echo of her heels on the tile floor reverberating in the quiet space. Inside, the precinct buzzed with the usual controlled chaos. Officers moved in and out, some chatting over coffee, others filing reports. The sight of Maya walking in, however, caught the attention of many. Whispers started almost immediately, a ripple of curiosity spreading through the room. She was a familiar face to some of them, a local advocate who had made waves in the community. But what was she doing here now, unannounced and with such purpose? Maya approached the front desk where a young officer looked up, surprised but polite. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Yes," Maya replied. "I'm here to see Chief Reynolds. Tell him Maya Carter is here." The officer hesitated, sensing the weight behind her words. He glanced at her shaved head, then back at her determined expression, before nodding and picking up the phone. "One moment." Maya waited, her eyes scanning the room. She noticed a few familiar faces among the officers, colleagues of Henderson's. Their glances were fleeting, avoiding her gaze, as if they already knew the storm that was about to hit. Moments later, the heavy door to the chief's office opened, and Chief Reynolds, a tall, stern man in his 50s, stepped out. His face was a mask of professionalism, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Maya," he greeted, his voice cautious. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she said. "But I thought it was time we had a conversation." Reynolds nodded, motioning for her to follow him. They walked past rows of desks and into his office, the door closing behind them with a soft click. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the air charged with unspoken words. "Have a seat," Reynolds offered, but Maya remained standing. "I won't take much of your time," she said, her voice steady. "But what I have to say is important." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, studying her. "All right," he said. "I'm listening." Maya placed a folder on his desk, her movements deliberate. "Inside this folder, you'll find evidence. Evidence of misconduct, abuse of power, and systemic failures that have gone unchecked in your department for years." Reynolds's expression hardened, but he didn't interrupt. Maya continued. "It's not just about Officer Ryan Henderson," she said. "Although his actions are at the center of this. It's about the culture that allowed someone like him to thrive. The cover-ups, the intimidation, the lack of accountability. This folder contains stories from victims, records of complaints that were ignored, and footage that speaks for itself. Reynolds opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents and photos inside. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "This isn't just going to the press," Maya said. "It's going to the Attorney General, the Civil Rights Division, and every watchdog organization that can shine a light on what's happening here. I'm done watching people like Henderson destroy lives while the system turns a blind eye." Reynolds looked up at her, his voice low. "You understand what you're doing, don't you? This could bring the whole department under scrutiny. Good officers could get caught in the crossfire." Maya's gaze didn't waver. "If they're good officers, they'll welcome the scrutiny. They'll want the truth to come out. Because that's what real justice looks like." Before Reynolds could respond, there was a knock at the door. It opened to reveal none other than Officer Henderson himself. He froze when he saw Maya standing there, his smug expression faltering for the first time. "What's going on here?" Henderson asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Maya turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his. "I was just explaining to the chief that your days of terrorizing this community are over." Henderson's face twisted into a sneer. "You think you can waltz in here and lecture us about how we do our jobs?" "You're just, careful," Maya interrupted, her voice sharp. "Choose your next words wisely, officer. Because from this moment forward, every step you take, every word you say, will be under a microscope. The days of you hiding behind that badge are over." Henderson's confidence wavered, but he forced a laugh. "This is a joke," he said, glancing at Reynolds. "You're not seriously listening to this." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his eyes still on the folder. For a long moment, he said nothing, the silence stretching thin. Finally, he looked up at Henderson. "I think you should sit down, Ryan," Reynolds said, his tone unreadable. Henderson's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about?" "Sit," Reynolds repeated, more firmly this time. Henderson hesitated, then reluctantly sank into the chair opposite Maya. The room felt electric, the weight of what was happening pressing down on all of them. "I've got nothing to hide," Henderson said, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. Maya's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good," she said. "Because by the time I'm done, the whole world will see exactly who you are." For the first time, Henderson looked genuinely nervous. The confidence he wore like armor was cracking, and beneath it, the man who had spent years abusing his power was exposed, vulnerable, desperate. Reynolds cleared his throat. "Maya," he said, "I need to review this evidence thoroughly. If what you've presented here holds up, and I suspect it does, there will be consequences. Serious ones." "I'll hold you to that," Maya said, her voice steady. She turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "Oh, and one more thing," she said, glancing back at Henderson. "You should probably start thinking about what you're going to do when that badge is gone. Because it's only a matter of time." As she walked out of the office, the tension in the precinct was palpable. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. Henderson sat frozen in his chair, the reality of what was happening finally dawning on him. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. As Maya walked out of the precinct, the weight of what she had just done began to settle in. The crisp air hit her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk, but it did little to cool the fire burning inside her. She had made her move, and now the pieces were in play. The system that had shielded Henderson for so long was finally under scrutiny, and she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Inside the precinct, the silence in Chief Reynolds' office was deafening. Henderson sat stiffly in the chair, his fingers gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. Across the desk, Reynolds methodically flipped through the contents of the folder Maya had left behind. The sound of paper rustling was the only noise in the room, but the tension was unbearable. "This is ridiculous," Henderson said finally, his voice low and defensive. You're really going to take her word over mine? Reynolds didn't look up. It's not just her word, Ryan, he said, his tone even but heavy. There are complaints here. Reports. Evidence. A lot of it. Complaints from criminals, Henderson spat. From people trying to discredit me. You know how it is out there, Chief. You've seen it. They're always looking for a reason to turn the tables. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. Ryan, this isn't just about a few complaints. This is a pattern. And I can't ignore it. You can ignore it, Henderson said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. You've ignored it before. We all have. Don't pretend this is new. Reynolds' eyes flicked up, sharp and piercing. That was before. Things are different now. Henderson barked a laugh, the sound bitter. Different? How? Because she walked in here with a folder full of sob stories. That doesn't change anything. You think the department's going to let her tear us apart? I think, Reynolds said slowly, that the department can't afford not to listen. You've put me in a position where I don't have a choice, Ryan. And frankly, I'm not sure you deserve the benefit of the doubt anymore. Henderson's face darkened, his bravado faltering. You don't mean that. I do, Reynolds said, his voice firm. And if half of what's in this folder is true, you're going to have a lot to answer for. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Henderson sat back in his chair, his jaw tight, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt cornered, out of control. He had spent his career building a shield of authority, using his badge to insulate himself from consequences. But now, that shield was cracking, and the person holding the hammer was someone he had underestimated. Later that evening, Maya sat in her living room, her laptop open on the coffee table. The glow from the screen illuminated her face as she read through messages from Rachel Alvarez. The story was set to go live the next morning, and Rachel had promised it would be thorough, unflinching, and impossible to ignore. Jaden sat on the couch beside her, a comic book in his hands, though his eyes kept darting toward her. He could sense the weight of the moment, even if he didn't fully understand it. Mom, he said after a while, his voice quiet. Are you scared? Maya looked up from the laptop, her eyes meeting his. She considered the question carefully before answering. A little, she admitted. But being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you're human. Jaden nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Do you think he's scared? The officer, I mean. Maya smiled faintly, reaching out to ruffle his hair. He should be. The next morning, the story broke. The headline was bold and unflinching, Abuse of Power, the Hidden Corruption in Our Police Department. It detailed years of misconduct, with Henderson at the center. Victims' stories were laid bare, their accounts corroborated by internal documents, footage, and witness testimony. The article didn't just implicate Henderson, it painted a picture of a department that had enabled and protected him. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage, the story spreading like wildfire. News outlets picked it up, amplifying the message. Protests began forming outside the precinct, people demanding accountability. And inside the building, the tension was at a boiling point. Henderson stormed into Reynolds' office, slamming the door behind him. This is a hit job, he growled, his face red with fury. You need to shut this down, Chief. Now. Reynolds didn't flinch. There's nothing to shut down, Ryan. The story's out. And it's not going away. You can't just throw me under the bus. Henderson shouted. After everything I've done for this department, everything I've done for you. This isn't about me, Reynolds said, his voice calm but firm. And it's not about loyalty. It's about accountability. Something you seem to have forgotten about. You're really going to let her win? Henderson sneered. You're going to let her drag us through the mud? This isn't about her winning, Reynolds snapped, his voice rising for the first time. It's about you losing. And you did this to yourself. Henderson's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, he realized there was no way out. The walls were closing in, and the power he had wielded so carelessly was slipping through his fingers. Meanwhile, Maya stood outside the precinct, watching as the crowd of protesters grew. Signs waved in the air, voices chanted for justice, and the energy was electric. Terrence stood beside her, his presence steady and grounding. You did it, he said quietly, his voice filled with admiration. You really did it. Maya nodded, her eyes fixed on the building. It's not over yet, she said. But this is a start. Inside, Reynolds made his final decision. Henderson was stripped of his badge and placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. As he walked out of the building, escorted by two fellow officers, the crowd outside erupted into cheers and jeers. Maya stood at the front of the crowd, her gaze locked on Henderson. For a moment, their eyes met. His were filled with anger and humiliation, but hers were calm, steady, and resolute. She didn't need to say anything, her presence alone was enough to remind him that the days of his unchecked power were over. As Henderson climbed into his car and drove away, Maya turned back to the crowd. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice was within reach. And she wasn't going to stop until it was. As Henderson's car disappeared down the street, the crowd outside the precinct remained, their energy unyielding. Chanting for change, their voices echoed through the neighborhood, calling for more than just one man's accountability. It wasn't about Henderson anymore, it was about the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Maya stood among them, her face calm but her mind racing. The victory was significant, but she knew it was only the beginning. Inside the precinct, Chief Reynolds sat at his desk, staring at the now infamous folder Maya had left behind. He had just ordered an internal review of the department, knowing full well what that decision would unleash. Officers he had worked with for decades were already bristling, their trust in him fracturing. Some resented the scrutiny, seeing it as a betrayal. Others stayed quiet, their own complicity weighing heavily on their silence. Reynolds reached for his phone, dialing a number he had hoped never to use. Captain Hargrove, he said when the line picked up. I need you to head the internal investigation. I want a full audit of every case tied to Henderson and any officer who's had complaints filed against them. There was a pause on the other end. Chief, do you understand what you're asking? Hargrove's voice was steady but tinged with unease. This could blow up the entire department. I know, Reynolds replied. But we don't have a choice. If we don't clean this up ourselves, someone else will. And it'll be a lot worse for all of us if it comes to that. Hargrove sighed, the weight of the task settling over him. Understood. I'll start first thing tomorrow. Reynolds hung up, leaning back in his chair. He closed his eyes, the exhaustion of the last few days catching up to him. For years, he had ignored the whispers, the complaints, the warning signs. He had justified it all under the guise of maintaining order, of protecting the reputation of the force. But now, as the walls of his carefully constructed world began to crumble, he realized the cost of his silence. Meanwhile, Maya sat at her kitchen table, the faint hum of the protests still audible in the distance. Jaden was asleep in his room, and the house was quiet, save for the occasional ping of her phone. Messages of support poured in, friends, colleagues, even strangers thanking her for standing up against the corruption that had plagued their community. But there were other messages too. Anonymous threats, veiled warnings, people trying to intimidate her into backing down. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Rachel Alvarez. Maya, Rachel said, her voice tinged with both excitement and concern. The story is blowing up. We're getting calls from national outlets, civil rights organizations, even politicians. This is bigger than we ever expected. I'm not surprised, Maya replied. People have been waiting for a moment like this. But Rachel, we need to stay focused. This isn't just a media storm, it's a fight for real change. I know, Rachel said. But you need to be careful. Henderson might be out, but the system that protected him is still intact. They're not going to go down without a fight. Maya nodded, even though Rachel couldn't see her. I'm ready for that fight. The next morning, the protests had grown even larger. News cameras lined the streets, capturing the diverse crowd that had gathered to demand justice. Maya arrived early, walking through the throng of people who greeted her with smiles, handshakes, and words of encouragement. She paused near the steps of the precinct, where a small group of community leaders was preparing to address the crowd. Terrence stood among them, his broad shoulders squared as he spoke with a young activist holding a megaphone. When he saw Maya, his face lit up. You made it, he said, his voice warm. I wouldn't miss it, Maya replied. This is what we've been working toward. As the leaders began to speak, Maya stepped back, letting their voices take center stage. She had never been one to seek the spotlight, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. But as she listened to their words, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her fight, it was about the fight of an entire community. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers shuffled past one another, avoiding eye contact. The internal review had already begun, and whispers of impending disciplinary actions were spreading like wildfire. Some officers openly resented Maya, blaming her for the upheaval. Others admired her courage, even if they couldn't say so out loud. In the break room, two younger officers sat in hushed conversation. Do you think they're actually going to fire people? One asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. I don't know, the other replied. But if half the stuff in that article is true, a lot of people are going down. Henderson was just the beginning. In his office, Reynolds stared out the window at the growing crowd. He knew the decisions he made in the coming days would define his career, and possibly the future of the department. With a deep breath, he turned back to his desk and began drafting a statement. It was time to face the public, to own the failures of his leadership and commit to real change. As the sun set on the city, Maya returned home, exhausted but resolute. She had spent the day speaking with activists, reporters, and community members, each conversation a reminder of why she had started this fight in the first place. But as she sat on her couch, her mind drifted to what lay ahead. The battle was far from over, and the forces against her were formidable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She froze, her pulse quickening. Rising slowly, she peered through the peephole to see Terrence standing on the porch, a concerned look on his face. Maya, he said when she opened the door. We need to talk. She stepped aside, letting him in. What's wrong? She asked. I've been hearing things, he said, his voice low. Some of the higher-ups in the department are trying to push back. They're saying you're just doing this for attention, that you're blowing things out of proportion. Maya's jaw tightened. Of course they are, she said. They're scared. They know the truth is coming out, and they can't stop it. Terrence nodded, but his expression remained serious. Be careful, Maya. They're not just scared, they're angry. And angry people do stupid things. I know, she said. But I didn't come this far to back down now. Terrence placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. Just promise me you'll watch your back. I will, Maya said, her voice steady. But right now, we need to keep pushing. This isn't over yet. As Terrence left, Maya sat back down, her resolve stronger than ever. The stakes were higher than ever, but she was ready. The system had thrived on silence and fear for too long. It was time for both to end. As the following days unfolded, the ripples of Maya's actions turned into waves, crashing through the city with relentless momentum. The protests grew louder, the media coverage more intense, and the demands for reform increasingly impossible to ignore. Maya had become a symbol of resistance and justice, whether she wanted the spotlight or not. At the precinct, the atmosphere was suffocating. Officers moved cautiously, the weight of uncertainty hanging over their every interaction. The internal review had begun exposing rot in unexpected places, and whispers about impending disciplinary actions grew louder with each passing hour. Those who had defended Henderson, either directly or through silence, found themselves in a precarious position. In the break room, a heated argument broke out between two officers. "You think throwing Henderson under the bus is going to save your job?" One officer, a burly man with a buzz cut, snapped. "We've all covered for each other. Don't act like you're innocent." The younger officer he was addressing folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "Maybe it's time we stopped covering for people like him. You think this ends with Ryan? They're coming for all of us if we don't clean this up ourselves." The burly officer scoffed, slamming his coffee mug down on the counter. "You sound just like her," he muttered. "All high and mighty until it's your turn under the microscope." Meanwhile, Maya was busy coordinating with community leaders and legal experts to ensure the momentum didn't falter. The protests were no longer just about Henderson, they had evolved into a broader movement demanding systemic change. Every meeting she attended, every strategy session, reminded her of the stakes. This wasn't just about one victory, it was about dismantling an entire system of injustice. Late one evening, as Maya sat in her living room, reviewing a list of demands drafted by the coalition of activists she had been working with, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Rachel Alvarez's name. "Maya," Rachel said, her voice brisk. "I just got a tip. Henderson's lawyers are planning a press conference tomorrow. Word is, they're going to frame this as a personal vendetta. They're claiming you targeted him because of your position and influence." Maya leaned back in her chair, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Of course they are," she said. "They're desperate. They're also dangerous," Rachel said. "They're trying to undermine everything you've worked for. If they paint you as biased or vindictive, it could hurt the entire movement." Maya closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Let them try," she said. "The truth is on our side." The next morning, Maya arrived at the protest earlier than usual. The air was thick with anticipation, a sense that something big was about to happen. A makeshift stage had been set up in front of the precinct, and community leaders were taking turns addressing the crowd. Maya listened intently, her mind focused on the next steps. Terrence found her near the edge of the crowd, his expression grim. "Did you hear about Henderson's press conference?" he asked. "I did," Maya replied. "And I'm not worried." "You should be," he said. "He's not just fighting for his reputation, he's fighting for survival. People like him don't go down quietly." Maya nodded, understanding the truth in his words. "That's why we have to be louder. Louder than his lies, louder than his fear. This is bigger than him, Terrence. It always has been." As the protest continued, Maya noticed a commotion near the stage. A group of counter-protesters had arrived, holding signs that read things like, "Support our police," and "Stop the witch hunt." The tension between the two groups was palpable, and Maya quickly made her way to the front lines to de-escalate the situation. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This isn't about hating the police. It's about accountability. It's about justice. And if you're here to defend Henderson, ask yourself why. What are you really defending?" Her words seemed to have an impact, at least on some of the counter-protesters, who lowered their signs and retreated. But the encounter left Maya shaken. The battle for justice wasn't just against the system, it was against deeply ingrained beliefs and fears. Later that afternoon, Henderson's press conference began. He stood at a podium in a rented hall, flanked by his lawyers. His face was a mask of defiance, but his body language betrayed his unease. "This has gone too far," Henderson began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. I have served this city for over 20 years, and I have done so with honor. The accusations against me are baseless, fueled by personal agendas and a biased media. As Henderson spoke, Maya watched the live stream on her phone, her jaw tightening. He painted himself as a victim, a scapegoat for a broken system, and even had the audacity to claim he had been targeted because of his race. The irony was staggering. When the press conference ended, Maya's phone lit up with messages and calls from allies and reporters. The narrative Henderson was pushing was dangerous, and she knew she needed to respond swiftly and decisively. That evening, Maya held a community meeting at a local church. The room was packed, the energy electric. She stood at the front, her voice carrying over the crowd. We knew this fight wouldn't be easy, she said. And we knew the people who have benefited from this system would fight back. Henderson's words today were a distraction, a desperate attempt to shift the blame. But we can't let him distract us. We have the truth on our side, and we're going to keep pushing until real change happens. Her words were met with thunderous applause, the crowd rising to their feet in solidarity. But even as she spoke, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were still ahead. Back at the precinct, the fallout from Henderson's press conference was immediate. Officers who had remained silent began to speak out, either in defense of Henderson or against him. The division within the department was stark, and Chief Reynolds found himself in the crossfire. In a tense meeting with his senior staff, Reynolds addressed the growing unrest. This department is at a crossroads, he said, his voice firm. We can either face the truth and work to rebuild trust with our community, or we can keep pretending everything is fine. But if we choose the latter, I promise you, we won't survive what's coming. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, the officers in that room realized the full scope of what was at stake, not just their careers, but the future of the institution they had sworn to uphold. As the meeting ended, Reynolds sat alone in his office, the glow of the city lights filtering through the window. He knew the decisions he made in the coming days would define not only his legacy but the path forward for the entire department. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the burden of leadership in its truest form. Outside, the protests continued, the chants of the crowd echoing into the night. And at the center of it all was Maya, standing firm, her resolve unshaken. The battle was far from over, but the tide was turning, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The night after Henderson's press conference, the city felt as though it were holding its breath. Maya sat in her living room, scrolling through endless messages on her phone. The responses to Henderson's statements were as polarized as she'd expected. Some people, emboldened by his victim narrative, were calling for the protests to stop, while others saw through his facade, demanding further accountability. It was a battle of perception now, and Maya knew it was critical to stay one step ahead. Her phone buzzed with a call from Rachel Alvarez. Maya, we need to move quickly, Rachel said, her voice brisk. Henderson's trying to rally support from his old allies in the department. If we don't put out something to counter his narrative, this could spiral. Maya nodded, even though Rachel couldn't see her. I've been thinking the same thing, she replied. We need to release the footage from the barbershop. Rachel hesitated. You're sure? That's a big move. Once it's out there, you can't take it back. I know, Maya said, her voice firm. But people need to see what he did. They need to understand this isn't just about one man's reputation, it's about the harm he caused, the abuse he got away with for years. If we don't show them the truth, he'll keep controlling the narrative. There was a long pause before Rachel spoke again. All right. I'll help you get it out. The next morning, the footage was released. It was raw and unfiltered, captured by the barbershop's security cameras. The video showed Henderson towering over Maya, his voice filled with disdain as he barked orders at her. It captured the moment he picked up the clippers, his smirk as he shaved her hair, and the stunned silence of the barbershop as Maya stood, unbroken, even in the face of such blatant humiliation. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage, the hashtags #JusticeForMaya and #ReformTheSystem trending within hours. News outlets picked up the footage, playing it alongside interviews with Maya and other victims of Henderson's abuse. The video was undeniable proof of his cruelty, and it left little room for his supporters to defend him. At the precinct, the fallout was swift. Officers who had previously stayed silent now found themselves cornered. Those who had turned a blind eye to Henderson's behavior were being called out, their complicity exposed. Chief Reynolds knew the department was on the brink of collapse, and he called an emergency meeting to address the growing crisis. In the packed conference room, Reynolds stood at the front, his expression grim. "You've all seen the video," he began, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "There's no denying what happened. Henderson's actions were inexcusable, and the fact that it took this long for him to be held accountable is a failure, on all of our parts." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the officers. Reynolds continued, his tone firm but measured. "This department has a choice to make. We can either face the truth and start rebuilding trust with our community, or we can dig in our heels and lose what little credibility we have left. But understand this, if you're not willing to be part of the solution, there will be no place for you here." One officer, a middle-aged man with a stern face, raised his hand. "Chief, with all due respect, how do we come back from this? The public doesn't trust us anymore." Reynolds met his gaze. "We come back by being honest. By admitting our mistakes and committing to real change. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But if we don't start now, we'll never get there." Back at the protest, Maya stood in front of the crowd, addressing the sea of people who had gathered to demand justice. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of someone who had lived through the fight. "When they see us standing together, they get scared," she said. "Because they know what we can accomplish when we refuse to be silenced. This isn't just about me, and it's not just about Henderson. It's about every person who has ever been told they don't matter, every person who has been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. We're here to say, no more. And we're not going anywhere until things change." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants of "Justice! Justice!" echoing through the streets. Maya stepped back, letting the energy of the moment wash over her. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Terence, his face filled with pride. "You're making history, Maya," he said. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," she replied. "We all are." But even as the momentum grew, Maya knew the fight was far from over. Henderson's supporters were still vocal, and the department was still deeply fractured. The release of the footage had been a turning point, but it was also a spark that could ignite further backlash. Later that evening, Maya received a call from Chief Reynolds. His voice was measured, but there was an undertone of weariness that she hadn't heard before. "Maya, I wanted to let you know we've initiated disciplinary actions against several officers connected to Henderson. It's a start, but there's a long road ahead." "I appreciate the update," Maya said. "But you and I both know this isn't just about a few bad actors. The entire system needs to change." "I know," Reynolds admitted. "And I'm working on it. But it's going to take time." "Time isn't something we can afford to waste," Maya said. "Every day we delay is another day people like Henderson get away with their actions. If you want to rebuild trust, you need to act decisively." Reynolds was silent for a moment. "You don't hold back, do you?" he said finally. "Not when it comes to justice," Maya replied. As the call ended, Maya leaned back in her chair, exhaustion creeping in. The fight was taking its toll, but she refused to let it deter her. She thought of Jaden, of the future she wanted for him, a world where he wouldn't have to fear the very people sworn to protect him. That vision kept her going, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. In the days that followed, the city began to see the first signs of change. The department announced new policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. A civilian oversight board was established, giving the community a voice in police matters. And Henderson's case was referred to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. But the fight was far from over. The protests continued, the calls for deeper reform growing louder. Maya remained at the forefront, her voice unwavering as she pushed for systemic change. And though the road ahead was long, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. The community had rallied around her, their collective strength a testament to what could be accomplished when people refused to be silenced. As the city grappled with its reckoning, Maya prepared for the next chapter of the fight. Henderson may have been the catalyst, but the movement was much bigger than him. And Maya was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what it took. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paper. Ryan Henderson sat at the defense table, his once commanding presence now reduced to a shadow of itself. His eyes darted around nervously as the judge entered, calling the session to order. The trial had been long and grueling, filled with testimony from victims, witnesses, and experts who laid bare the extent of Henderson's abuses. Maya watched from the gallery, her expression calm but focused. This was the final chapter, the culmination of everything she had fought for. Jaden sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, a silent reminder of why she had pushed so hard. As the jury filed in, the foreperson handed the verdict to the judge, and the room collectively held its breath. On the charges of misconduct, abuse of power, and falsification of records, we find the defendant guilty. A ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom. For Henderson, it was the end of the road. He slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. The sentence was harsh but fair, a prison term that ensured he would never hold power again. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers. Maya stood at the steps, surrounded by supporters, her face illuminated by the glow of camera lights. Reporters shouted questions, but she raised her hand, signaling for quiet. "This isn't just about one man," she said, her voice steady. "It's about a system that allowed people like him to thrive. Today is a step forward, but the work isn't done. We will keep fighting until justice is not the exception but the rule." As the crowd cheered, Maya turned to leave, feeling a mix of relief and determination. The fight had been long and hard, but it had also been worth it. For Chief Reynolds, the verdict marked a turning point. Under immense pressure, he had overseen the implementation of sweeping reforms within the department. Officers were undergoing new training, and the newly established Civilian Oversight Board was already holding its first hearings. Reynolds himself had faced criticism for his role in maintaining the status quo for so long, but he chose to stay, determined to rebuild trust and do things differently. One evening, he called Maya. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. "You pushed us to be better, even when it wasn't easy. I can't change the past, but I promise you, the department will be different moving forward." "It's about time," Maya replied, her tone not unkind. "Just make sure it lasts." As for the barbershop, it returned to being the lively hub it had always been. Terrence, who had supported Maya every step of the way, became an unofficial spokesperson for the movement. The shop now doubled as a space for community organizing, its walls adorned with photos and posters from the protests. Maya's own life had changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her work had caught the attention of national civil rights organizations, and she was offered a position leading a major reform initiative. It was a chance to take the fight beyond her city, to help others facing the same struggles she had fought so hard against. But she hesitated. She loved her community, and leaving it felt like walking away from everything she had built. One evening, as she and Jaden sat on the porch, he turned to her, his eyes bright with curiosity. "What are you going to do next, Mom?" he asked. Maya smiled, her heart full. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But whatever it is, I want it to matter." Jaden nodded, his small hand slipping into hers. "It will. You always make things matter. And in that moment, Maya knew she wasn't just fighting for the world as it was, she was fighting for the world as it could be. Reflecting on this story, there's something we all need to take away. Maya's fight wasn't just hers, it was a collective battle for justice and accountability. Henderson's downfall wasn't just about his personal failure, it was a reminder of what happens when power is unchecked. But more importantly, this story shows us that change is possible when people stand together, refuse to be silenced, and demand better. So, what about you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice? What would you do to stand up for what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going, because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to inspire action. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more powerful narratives from Tales of Twist. Together, we can shine a light on the stories that matter most. See you next time.